My daughter-in-law shoved me so hard I stumbled into the doorway while my own son watched without lifting a finger. She told me to go away as if I were an unwanted stray, and then she laughed the kind of laugh that tells you she no longer sees you as family at all. In that moment, something inside me cracked, not from pain but from clarity. For years, I had let them walk over me, treating me like a free babysitter, a spare wallet, a silent old man taking up space in the home I had paid for. That day, her shove was the final reminder that I had become invisible in my own bloodline. But what she did not know was that the house she lived in, the one she bragged about as if it were theirs, had never belonged to them. It was still legally mine. And while she celebrated humiliating me, I made a quiet decision that would turn her perfect little world upside down. I sold the house without warning, without guilt, and without looking back. 6 hours later, the calls began, one after another, relentless, desperate, panicked. 47 missed calls from the same woman who had pushed me aside like garbage. If she thought that shove would make me disappear, she was about to learn how wrong she was. Because this time I am not the quiet father-in-law who endures everything. This time I am the man who will let them feel every ounce of the disrespect they showed me, and the revenge that follows will be something they never saw coming. My name is Walter Reeves. I am 68 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 40 years designing bridges and highways across 3 states. I built my career on precision, on calculating loads and stresses, on understanding exactly how much weight a structure can bear before it breaks. I thought I understood pressure. I thought I knew my limits. But nothing in 4 decades of engineering prepared me for the moment my own daughter-in-law shoved me to the ground in the house I built with my own 2 hands. It started over a chair. Nora's reading chair, the faded blue one that still sits by the window where she used to watch the birds every morning. I had moved it 3 inches to catch the afternoon light the way she always liked it. Melissa wanted it gone. She said it cluttered the living room, made the space feel dated. I told her as calmly as I could manage that the chair would stay where it was. That's when her face changed. "You don't get to make decisions about this house anymore," she said, her voice rising. "You're a guest here, Walter. Do you understand that a guest who doesn't pay rent, doesn't contribute, doesn't do anything except take up space?" I should have walked away. I've learned after 3 years of living under her roof, under my roof, the one I built, that walking away is usually the wisest choice. But something in me couldn't retreat. Not this time. Not about Nora's chair. "This is my house," I said quietly. "My name is on the deed. I designed every room. I poured the foundation with my own hands." Melissa stepped closer. Her eyes were cold in a way that still unsettles me when I think about it, not angry exactly, but calculating. Like she was measuring something. "Your house," she laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You can barely climb the stairs without wheezing. You forget where you put your glasses. You're not capable of owning anything anymore." Then she pushed me. Not hard by most standards. Just 2 hands against my chest, a sharp shove that caught me off balance. But when you're 68 and your knees aren't what they used to be, it doesn't take much. I stumbled backward, arms flailing for something to grab, and crashed into the hallway table. The wedding photo, the one of me and Nora from 1981, her in that simple white dress, me looking like I'd won the lottery just standing next to her, flew off the surface and shattered against the hardwood floor. I landed beside it, glass cutting into my palm, blood mixing with the shards that now covered my wife's smiling face. For a moment, everything went silent. I looked up and saw Jason standing in the doorway. My son, my only child. The boy I taught to ride a bicycle, to throw a baseball, to drive a stick shift on the back roads outside of town. He was watching. He saw everything. I waited for him to speak, to defend me, to say something. He sighed, the heavy, exhausted sigh of a man who has chosen his side long ago and doesn't want to be reminded of the cost. "Dad," he said, not looking at me but at Melissa, checking her expression like a dog checking its owner's mood, "maybe it's time you stop being in everyone's way." The words hit harder than the floor. Melissa straightened her blouse, brushing off invisible dust. "This is exactly why you can't stay here anymore," she said, flatly stepping over me like I was a piece of furniture that needed moving. "Go to your room. We have guests coming in an hour, and I won't have you embarrassing us." She walked away. Jason followed her without another glance. I sat there for a long time, blood dripping from my hand onto the broken glass. Eventually, I picked up the photograph. The frame was destroyed, but the picture itself had survived, cracked through the middle, a jagged line running right between Nora and me, but still intact. I could still see her eyes, warm and knowing the way they always were when she looked at me. I carried it to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, pressing it against my chest. "I built this house for us," I whispered to her face. "Every beam, every wall. I built it for our family, Nora. And look what they've done to it. Look what they've done to me." Something shifted inside me then. Not anger. Anger is loud, and this was quiet. Not despair. Despair makes you want to give up, and I didn't want to give up. It was something else. Something patient and clear, like the first line drawn on a blueprint before a building takes shape. I looked at Nora's cracked smile and made her a promise. "Something has to change," I said. "And I think you already knew it would." The next morning, Melissa left a note on my door. No greeting, no signature, just a list of tasks written in her sharp handwriting. The third item read, "Clean out the hallway closet. It's full of junk. Donate or discard everything by Friday." She had underlined everything twice. I stood in front of that closet for a long time before I could bring myself to open it. Nora's things were in there. Her winter coats, her gardening gloves, boxes of photographs we never got around to organizing. Melissa called it junk. To me, it was 40 years of a life that meant everything. I started slowly pulling out old jackets that still smelled faintly of Nora's perfume, setting aside the Christmas decorations she insisted on keeping even when the tinsel started falling apart. And as I worked, the memories came flooding back, not painful ones, but warm ones like sunlight through an old window. I remembered 1982. We were 24 years old, married for barely a year, and so broke we counted pennies at the grocery store. We had been renting a tiny apartment above a hardware store, dreaming of something more. One evening, Nora spread a map across our kitchen table and pointed to a piece of land on the outskirts of town. "There," she said, "that's where we're going to build our home." I laughed and told her we couldn't afford a shed, let alone a house. She just smiled, that stubborn, beautiful smile that always meant she had already made up her mind. "You're an engineer," she said. "Design it yourself. We'll build it together." It took us 3 summers. I drew the blueprints at night after work, calculating every beam and joint, making sure the structure would last 100 years. Nora learned to mix concrete to sandwood, to paint trim with steady hands. We fought sometimes about window placement, about whether the porch should wrap around or stop at the front, but we always made up before the sun went down. That was our rule. She painted the kitchen yellow. I wanted white, something clean and simple, but Nora shook her head. "Kitchens should feel like sunshine," she said, dipping her brush into a can of the brightest yellow I had ever seen. "Even on the darkest days, this room will feel warm." The yellow has faded now, muted by time and grease and years of morning light. Melissa has mentioned repainting it at least a dozen times. I have always refused. Some things shouldn't be changed just because they've grown old. Deep in the back of the closet, behind a stack of old tax returns and a box of Jason's childhood drawings, I found a wooden box I hadn't opened in years. The lid was dusty, the hinges stiff, but I recognized it immediately. Nora had kept it on her nightstand for decades, always within reach, always private. I carried it to the bed and sat down, my heart beating faster than it should have. Inside, I found pieces of our life together. Photographs from our honeymoon, Nora laughing on a beach in Maine, her hair wild from the wind. Love letters from our courtship written in my clumsy handwriting before I learned that words mattered as much as numbers. The original blueprints for this house covered in Nora's notes and corrections, her handwriting cramped in the margins where she suggested moving a doorway or adding another window. And beneath all of it, a leather journal I had never seen before. I opened it carefully, turning the yellowed pages until I reached the last entry. The date stopped me cold 3 months before Nora died. Her handwriting was weaker, then shakier, but still unmistakably hers. I've seen how Melissa looks at this house she had written, not with love, with calculation. She measures the rooms like she's already deciding what to sell. She watches Walter like he's an obstacle, not a person. He doesn't see it yet. He loves Jason too much to see clearly, but he will. Eventually he will. I read the words 3 times, each time feeling something tighten in my chest. Nora had known. Even as she was dying, she had seen what I refused to see. At the very bottom of the box, wrapped in a small piece of black velvet, I found something else, a brass key, old-fashioned, the kind that might open a lockbox or a safe. I had never seen it before. There was no label, no explanation, just a sticky note in Nora's handwriting pressed against the velvet. "For when you're ready to fight back." I was still staring at it when the doorbell rang. Carolyn Blake stood on the porch holding a pot of soup as she did every Wednesday. She was 65, a widow like me, and had been Nora's closest friend for 40 years. After Nora passed, Carolyn made it her mission to check on me weekly, always with food, always with quiet company that never demanded conversation. She noticed my bandaged hand immediately but didn't ask about it. Instead, she set the soup on the kitchen counter and said softly, "Nora was worried about you, you know. Even at the end, she made me promise to watch over you." I didn't respond. I was still holding the key. Carolyn's eyes drifted to the wooden box on the table and something flickered across her face, recognition maybe, or understanding. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. "Some things take time," she said finally. "Nora always said you'd figure it out when you were ready." After she left, I sat alone in the fading afternoon light, turning the key over in my palm. It was warm from my grip, small enough to disappear in a closed fist, yet heavy, with questions I didn't know how to answer. "What were you trying to tell me, Nora?" I whispered to the empty room. "And why didn't you tell me while you were still here?" The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of small humiliations. I kept the brass key hidden in my nightstand drawer, tucked beneath a Bible I hadn't opened in years. Some nights I would take it out and turn it over in my hands, wondering what lock it might open, what secrets Nora had kept from me. But the mornings always came too quickly, and with them came Melissa's voice cutting through the house like a blade. She had turned me into unpaid help. There is no gentler way to say it. Every morning brought a new list of tasks: carry these boxes to the attic, scrub the guest bathroom, reorganize the garage, weed the flower beds. When I moved too slowly, which was often now that my knees ached and my back protested every bend, she would sigh loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. The burden of elderly parents, she would mutter not quite under her breath. "No one tells you how exhausting it is." The worst part was how she spoke about me as if I weren't there. I would be standing 3 feet away, washing dishes or folding laundry, and she would turn to Jason and say, "He doesn't understand how hard this is for us. He just doesn't get it." She used he like I was a piece of furniture, something to be discussed and managed, rather than a person with ears and feelings and 68 years of memories. Jason never corrected her. He barely looked at me anymore. I tried to talk to him. I tried dozens of times in those first weeks after the shove, after I found Nora's journal and read her warnings about Melissa. But every attempt met a wall. A work call he had to take, a headache that needed quiet, an appointment he couldn't miss. He was physically present, eating dinner at the table. I built sleeping in the bedroom where he grew up, but emotionally my son had become a ghost in his own house. One evening I finally cornered him in the garage. He was pretending to look for a screwdriver, but I could tell he was just hiding from the tension inside. "Jason," I said quietly, "we need to talk. About what happened, about how things are." He didn't turn around. His shoulders tensed, and I watched him grip the edge of the workbench like he was bracing for impact. "Dad, please." His voice was tired, so tired. "I can't do this right now. Just go along with things." "For me, can you do that just for a little while? Go along with what I asked? Being treated like a stranger in my own home, being shoved to the ground by your wife." He flinched at that, but still wouldn't face me. "She didn't mean it," he said. "She's under a lot of stress. We both are. Just, please, Dad, don't make this harder than it has to be." He walked past me without another word, and I stood alone in the garage, surrounded by tools I had taught him to use, wondering when I had lost my son completely. But there was one person in that house who still saw me clearly. Lily was 11 years old, quiet in the way that observant children often are. She had her mother's dark hair, but her father's eyes, my eyes, Nora used to say, and she watched everything with a seriousness that seemed too heavy for her age. She was always in the corner of whatever room I happened to be, in her iPad clutched in her small hands, supposedly playing games or watching videos. I noticed, though, that she often held the screen up when Melissa was speaking to me. Not obviously she was careful, this child, but enough that I began to wonder. One afternoon, Melissa was berating me for leaving a coffee cup on the counter. "Useless dead weight," she snapped. "I don't know why we even bother." I saw Lily look up sharply from her corner. Her finger hovered over the screen, and I realized with a sudden clarity what she was doing. She was recording. Our eyes met for just a moment. She didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge what had passed between us. She simply looked back down at her iPad and continued whatever she had been doing. But I understood. This child, my granddaughter, was keeping a record of her mother's cruelty. I said nothing. Some weapons are more powerful when they remain hidden. Carolyn came by that Wednesday with her usual pot of soup and her usual quiet company. But this time, after Melissa had retreated upstairs and Jason had disappeared into his office, she pulled me aside in the kitchen. "Walter," she said softly, glancing toward the stairs to make sure we were alone. "Nora told me things before she passed. Things she was afraid to tell you because she didn't want to poison your relationship with Jason." I felt my heart tighten. What things? Carolyn hesitated, choosing her words carefully. She saw what was happening. She saw what Melissa was becoming, how she was already starting to push you aside even while Nora was still alive. She wanted to warn you, but she was scared. Scared you wouldn't believe her. Scared it would drive a wedge between you and your son. "So she said nothing," I whispered. "She said nothing to you," Carolyn corrected. "But she prepared." That was Nora, always thinking 3 steps ahead. She paused. "There's something she left for you, Walter. Something she gave to me for safekeeping. But she made me promise to wait. She said you wouldn't be ready right away. She said I would know when the time was right." I thought of the brass key in my nightstand, the journal entry warning me about Melissa, the sticky note that said, "For when you're ready to fight back." "What did she leave?" I asked. Carolyn squeezed my hand, her grip firm, despite her age. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "When things get bad enough, come find me," she whispered. "Nora left me something to give you, but only when the time was right." April 15th arrived with the kind of bright spring weather that felt like mockery. The sky was clear, the birds were singing, and Melissa had spent the entire week transforming the house into a celebration venue. Streamers hung from the ceiling. Balloons clustered in corners. A catering company delivered trays of food I was not allowed to touch. It was Jason's 42nd birthday. It was also the 2nd anniversary of Nora's death. I mentioned this to Melissa 3 days before the party, hoping she had simply forgotten. I found her in the kitchen arranging flowers, roses, not the lilies Nora loved, and I cleared my throat gently. "Melissa," I said, keeping my voice calm. "April 15th. You know what day that is." She didn't look up from the vase. "Jason's birthday. It's also the day Nora passed. 2 years ago." Her hands paused for just a moment before continuing their work. "Life is for the living, Walter." Nora would understand. She wouldn't want Jason to stop celebrating just because she happened to die on an inconvenient date. Happened to die. Like it was a scheduling conflict. Like 43 years of marriage could be waved away because it interfered with party planning. "She wouldn't understand," I said quietly. "And neither do I." Melissa finally looked at me, her expression the patient condescension of someone explaining something obvious to a slow child. "This is exactly what I mean about you making everything difficult. It's one day, Walter. One day that doesn't have to be sad anymore. Try to think about someone other than yourself for once." She turned back to her flowers, and I understood with perfect clarity that arguing would change nothing. She knew what she was doing. The cruelty was not accidental. It was precise. The party began at 6 o'clock. By 6:15, I had been exiled to the porch. "We need the space," Melissa explained, her hand firm on my elbow as she guided me toward the door. "There are 40 guests coming, and you'll just be in the way. You can watch from outside. Get some fresh air. It'll be good for you." The door closed behind me, and I stood alone on the porch I had built with my own hands 30 years ago. I could hear the music starting inside, the rise and fall of conversation, the clink of glasses. Through the window, I watched Melissa greeting guests with her bright, perfect smile, touching Jason's arm possessively whenever another woman came near. She was performing the role of devoted wife, gracious hostess, loving daughter-in-law. No one inside that house would ever guess what she had said to me, what she had done. I sat down in the old rocking chair, Nora's chair, the one we used to share on summer evenings, and watched the sun begin to set. No one came to check on me. No one brought me food. No one even glanced toward the porch to see if I was still there. Through the glass, I could see the long table covered with dishes, the birthday cake with its blazing candles, the guests laughing and eating food prepared in my kitchen served on plates Nora and I had received as wedding gifts. I was 10 feet away and completely invisible. An hour passed, maybe longer. The sky turned orange, then purple, then dark. The music grew louder. The laughter grew sharper. I sat in the growing cold and thought about the April 15th, 2 years ago, when I had held Nora's hand as she took her last breath, when I had promised her I would be okay, when I had believed that grief was the worst thing I would ever have to survive. I was wrong. The door opened suddenly, startling me. Melissa stood there holding a paper plate, her expression blank. "Here," she said, thrusting it toward me. "We saved you some." I looked down at the plate. A single slice of cake crushed and lopsided, the frosting smeared across the paper. It had clearly been scraped from the bottom of the pan, the piece no one else wanted. The corner was missing entirely, as if someone had taken a bite and decided it wasn't worth finishing. "Thank you," I said, because what else could I say? She closed the door without responding. I set the plate on the porch railing and didn't touch it. The night air was cold now, but I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. Instead, I moved closer to the window, staying in the shadows where no one could see me. That's when I heard Melissa's voice carrying through the cracked window with perfect clarity. "Taking care of elderly parents is such a burden," she was saying to a woman I didn't recognize. "My friend just put her mother in a lovely facility, Sunrise Gardens, I think. They handle everything. The feeding, the medication, the constant supervision. Sometimes it's the kindest thing you can do. For everyone involved." I felt the blood drain from my face. Through the glass, I could see Jason standing nearby. He wasn't participating in the conversation, but he was listening. And as Melissa continued talking about quality of care and professional environments, I saw him flinch just barely, just for a moment. A flicker of something that might have been guilt crossing his face before he smoothed it away. He knew. My son knew what his wife was planning, and he was doing nothing to stop it. I went to my room that night, without saying goodnight to anyone. The party was still going when I closed my door, the bass from the music vibrating through the walls. I sat on the edge of my bed and pulled out Nora's journal, turning the pages slowly, looking for something I might have missed. I found it near the middle, an entry dated a year before her diagnosis. "If they push you away, my love," she had written, "then maybe it's time to walk. But walk towards something, not just away. Promise me you'll remember that. Walking away without direction is just wandering. Walking towards something is purpose." I read the words 3 times, feeling them settle into my bones. Nora had seen this coming. She had tried to prepare me, and now finally I was beginning to understand what she wanted me to do. The morning after the party, I made a decision. Nora had told me to walk toward something, and I finally understood where I needed to go. I waited until Melissa left for her yoga class, and Jason disappeared into his home office. Then I took the brass key from my nightstand drawer, put on my good jacket, and drove across town to an address I had found in Nora's journal. Douglas Wright's office was on the 2nd floor of an old brick building downtown above a bakery that filled the stairwell with the smell of fresh bread. The waiting room was small but warm, with leather chairs and walls covered in family photographs, children at graduations, wedding portraits, 3 generations gathered around Christmas trees. This was a man who understood what family meant. I hoped he would understand what mine had become. The receptionist led me back after only a few minutes. Douglas rose from behind his desk to shake my hand. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, the grip of someone who had learned that strength didn't require force. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "please sit down. What can I do for you?" I had rehearsed what I wanted to say during the drive over, but now the words felt clumsy in my mouth. "I need to understand my rights," I began. "About my house, about my family, about what I can do when." I paused, struggling. "When the people living with me don't want me there anymore." Douglas nodded slowly, his expression careful. "I see. Can you tell me more about your situation?" So I told him. Not everything, not the shove, not the cake, not the conversation about nursing homes I had overheard through the window, but enough. Enough for him to understand that I was a man who had built a house with his own hands and was now being treated like a trespasser in it. When I mentioned Nora's name, something changed in his face. The professional distance softened into something more personal. "Nora Reeves," he said quietly. "Your wife. You knew her. She was one of the most organized clients I ever had." He leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "She came to me 2 years before she passed. Said she wanted to protect what mattered. I assumed she meant finances, estate planning, the usual concerns. But the more we talked, the more I realized she was planning for something specific. She was worried about you, Mr. Reeves, about what might happen to you after she was gone." I felt my throat tighten. "She never told me. She never mentioned any of this. She asked me not to contact you unless you came to me first. She said you were proud, that you wouldn't want to believe anything bad about your family until you saw it for yourself." He paused. "She also said you would come eventually. She seemed certain of it. 2 years. Nora had been preparing for this moment 2 years before she died, and I had never suspected a thing. I thought I knew my wife completely, but she had kept this hidden, waiting for a day she hoped would never come. Douglas pulled a folder from his filing cabinet and spread several documents across his desk. Let's start with what I can confirm. The house on Maple Street, you built it yourself, correct? In 1982, took 3 summers, and the deed is in your name, only always has been. Nora and I talked about adding her, but we never got around to it. After she passed, it didn't seem to matter. Douglas nodded, scanning the paperwork. Then, let me be clear, Mr. Reeves. That house belongs entirely to you. Your son and daughter-in-law have no legal claim to it whatsoever. They are guests in your home, guests who, from what you've described, have overstayed their welcome. He looked up. If you wanted to ask them to leave, you would need to provide 30 days written notice. That's standard for family members in this state. But the law is firmly on your side. No one can force you out of your own property. I let that sink in. For months I had felt like a prisoner in my own home, but the truth was simpler and more powerful than I had realized. The house was mine. It had always been mine. Melissa's demands her, lists her contempt. None of it gave her any right to the walls I had built with my own hands. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the brass key. There's something else, I said. I found this in a box of Nora's things. I don't know what it opens. Douglas's eyes widened when he saw it. He took the key carefully, turning it over in his palm, and then he smiled, a sad, knowing smile. Nora rented a safe deposit box at First National Bank, he said. She paid for it in advance. 20 years of fees all at once. She told me that someday you would come asking about it, and when you did, I should give you this. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a business card with the bank's address printed on it. I don't know what's inside, Mr. Reeves. She never told me. But she was very clear that only you could open it. I took the card, feeling its weight like a promise. As I left the office and stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text from an unknown number. The message was short, just 2 lines. Grandpa, I'm saving everything. Love, Lily. Below the text was a video file. I pressed play with trembling fingers. Melissa's face filled the screen, her expression twisted with contempt. Useless, dead weight, she was saying, her voice sharp and cruel. I don't know why we even bother. The video was only 12 seconds long, but it was enough. My 11-year-old granddaughter had been building evidence clip by clip, recording her mother's cruelty when no one else was watching. I saved the video and looked up at the sky, feeling something shift inside me. I was not alone. Nora had prepared the ground. Lily was watching from the shadows, and Douglas Wright was waiting for my next move. I thought of his final words as I had walked out the door, the business card pressed into my palm. Whatever Nora left you, he had said quietly, she wanted you to have it when you were ready to fight. Are you ready, Walter? I looked at the bank's address, then at my granddaughter's message, then at the brass key still warm in my pocket. Yes, I was ready. I did not go to the bank that day. Something told me to wait, to let the pieces fall into place before I made my next move. Nora had been patient in her planning. I could be patient too. So I returned home, hid the business card in my nightstand beside the brass key, and waited for whatever would come next. It came 3 nights later, long after the house had fallen silent. I was lying awake in the darkness, as I often did now, when I heard the soft creak of footsteps in the hallway. A knock came at my door, hesitant, almost apologetic. Before I could respond, the door opened and Jason slipped inside. He looked terrible. His face was pale and drawn with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. He had lost weight in recent weeks. I realized his clothes hanging loose on a frame that used to be solid. My son looked like a man being hollowed out from the inside. Dad, he said quietly, can we talk? I sat up and turned on the bedside lamp. The light seemed to make him flinch. It's 2 a.m, Jason. I know. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I remembered from his childhood. I couldn't sleep. I need to. I have to tell you something. He sat down heavily on the edge of my bed, not looking at me. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared at his hands like they belonged to someone else. The business is failing, he finally said. My accounting firm. I've been losing clients for over a year. I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want to admit. He swallowed hard. I've been hiding it. From everyone. Even from Melissa at first. But she found out. She went through my files. I waited, saying nothing. She wanted me to take out a second mortgage on the business property to cover the debts to keep things afloat. He laughed bitterly. The bank denied it. Our credit is destroyed. We're 3 months behind on the car payments. The birthday party last week, we put it all on credit cards we can't pay off. I thought of the lavish decorations, the catering, the guests drinking champagne while I sat alone on the porch with a crushed piece of cake. All of it funded by money they didn't have. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Jason finally looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before, desperation so raw it bordered on panic. Because Melissa thinks there's another way. His voice dropped. She wants you to sell the house, Dad. Give us the proceeds as an investment in our future. She says it's the only option left. She says you owe us that much. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I owe you, that's what she says. I don't, he stopped, shook his head. I'm not demanding, Dad. I'm asking. I'm begging. Please. We're drowning here. For a moment I almost felt sorry for him. My son, the boy I had raised, the man I had hoped would carry on everything good that Nora and I had built together. He was drowning, yes, but he had chosen to swim in these waters. He had chosen the woman who was pulling him under. No, I said quietly. His face crumpled. Dad, please. You don't understand. If we can't figure something out, Melissa says we might need to. Explore other options. For you, he couldn't meet my eyes. Long-term care options. She's already talked to someone about it. A facility. She says it would be better for everyone. There it was. The threat I had overheard through the window now spoken aloud. Not a vague concern for my well-being. A plan. A conspiracy. My daughter-in-law wanted to put me in a nursing home so she could take my house and sell it out from under me. And Jason knew. He had known for weeks, maybe longer. He was part of it. Something shifted inside me then. Not anger, I had moved past anger. Not hurt, I had been hurt so many times now that the wounds had become familiar. What I felt was clarity. Cold, clean, absolute clarity. You've forgotten something important, son. My voice was calm, calmer than I had expected. This isn't your house to sell. It isn't Melissa's house to take. It's mine. I designed it. I built it. I poured the foundation with my own hands before you were born, and I will decide what happens to it. Jason stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Go back to bed, I said. We're done here. He stood slowly, his shoulders slumped in defeat. At the door, he paused and looked back at me. I'm sorry, Dad, he whispered. It was the same thing he had said a dozen times before, but this time I heard what the words really meant. Not I'm sorry for what's happening. Not I'm sorry for how Melissa treats you. Something simpler and more damning. I'm sorry I can't protect you from her. The door closed softly behind him, and I sat alone in the lamplight, listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway. My son had made his choice. He had chosen his wife over his father, his fear over his duty, his weakness over everything I had tried to teach him. I reached into the nightstand and pulled out the brass key. It gleamed dully in the light, small but solid, holding secrets I had yet to discover. Tomorrow I would go to the bank. Tomorrow I would find out what Nora had left me. And then I would fight back. I did not make it to the bank the next morning. Melissa announced at breakfast that she needed the car for errands, and when I suggested I could drive her and then continue on my own, she looked at me like I had proposed something absurd. You're not safe behind the wheel anymore, she said flatly. I've seen how you drift at intersections. We should probably talk about taking your license away. So I stayed home, trapped again, watching through the window as she drove off in the car I had paid for. By afternoon, the walls of my room felt like they were closing in. I needed air. I needed to feel the sun on my face and remember that the world existed beyond Melissa's control. So I walked out to the front porch and sat down in the old rocking chair, the one Nora and I used to share on summer evenings, and I closed my eyes and let the breeze wash over me. I must have dozed off. When I opened my eyes, Melissa was standing over me, and she was not alone. The Hendersons from across the street were walking their dog. Mrs. Patterson was checking her mailbox. The young couple who had moved in last spring were unloading groceries from their car. Half the neighborhood was within earshot. Melissa did not lower her voice. Do you see what I deal with every day? She announced, gesturing at me like I was an exhibit in a museum of disappointment. He just sits here while Jason and I work ourselves to death. Dead weight. Absolute dead weight. She shook her head dramatically. Sometimes I think he's losing his mind. He forgets things. He wanders. I don't know how much longer we can manage. I felt my face burn with humiliation. The neighbors were staring. Mrs. Patterson had frozen with her hand still in the mailbox. The young couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Melissa," I said quietly, "please. Please," what she turned to face the street, making sure everyone could hear. "Please pretend everything is fine. Please ignore the fact that we've sacrificed our lives to take care of someone who doesn't even appreciate it." That's when I heard Carolyn's voice, sharp and clear. "That's quite enough." She was walking her little terrier down the sidewalk, but now she stopped directly in front of our house. Her eyes were fixed on Melissa with a coldness I had never seen before. "Walter Reeves has more dignity in his little finger than some people have in their entire lives," Carolyn said evenly. "I've known him for 40 years. He built this house himself. He raised a family in it. He nursed his wife through her final illness without a word of complaint. So perhaps you should think twice before you stand on his porch and call him dead weight." Melissa's expression flickered with something like shock before settling into a sneer. "Mind your own business, Carolyn." Carolyn smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Nora was my best friend for 40 years. Her husband is my business." For a moment no one moved. Then Melissa turned sharply and walked back into the house, slamming the door behind her. The neighbors slowly returned to their activities, avoiding my eyes, pretending they hadn't witnessed anything. Carolyn gave me a small nod before continuing down the sidewalk with her dog. I sat on the porch for a long time, my heart pounding. When I finally went inside, Melissa was waiting for me in the kitchen. Her face was composed now, the public performance over, but her eyes were dangerous. "If you ever embarrass me like that again," she said softly, stepping close enough that I could smell her perfume, "if you ever turn people against me, I will make sure you spend your final years in a place where no one will hear you complain. Do you understand me?" I understood. This was not anger. This was a promise. She held my gaze for a long moment, then walked away without another word. That evening, as the sun was setting, my phone buzzed with a text from Carolyn. "Come over when you can. There's something you need to see." I waited until Melissa and Jason were occupied with dinner, then slipped out the back door and walked the short path to Carolyn's house. She was waiting on her porch, her expression serious in the fading light. "Come inside," she said. Her living room was warm and cluttered with photographs, many of them featuring Nora, I noticed. The two of them at a church picnic, standing arm in arm at someone's wedding, laughing over coffee cups in this very room. Carolyn reached into a drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope. The paper was cream-colored, slightly yellowed with age. On the front, in Nora's familiar handwriting, was a single word, Walter. "She gave this to me the week before she died," Carolyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "Made me promise not to give it to you until you were ready. She said I would know when that was." She pressed the envelope into my hands, her eyes wet. "I think you're ready now, Walter." I held the envelope carefully, feeling its weight. Not the weight of paper, there couldn't have been more than a few pages inside. But the weight of years, the weight of love, the weight of a woman who had seen the future and tried to prepare her husband for a battle she knew he would have to fight alone. "She knew," I whispered. "Nora knew this would happen." Carolyn nodded slowly. "She knew a lot of things, Walter. She just couldn't figure out how to tell you without breaking your heart." I did not sleep that night. I sat in my room with Carolyn's envelope unopened on my lap, afraid of what I might find inside. But when morning came and the first gray light crept through the curtains, I knew I could not wait any longer. I had the brass key. I had the bank's address. And now I had whatever final message Nora had entrusted to her closest friend. I left the house before Melissa woke, taking nothing but my wallet, the key, and the envelope. The drive to First National Bank took 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. My hands were steady on the wheel, steadier than they had been in weeks. Something about moving toward the truth instead of running from it gave me a calm I hadn't expected. The bank manager recognized Nora's name immediately. She was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and silver earrings, and when I explained why I was there, her expression softened with something like respect. "Mrs. Reeves was a remarkable woman," she said quietly as she led me to the vault. "She came in every year to check on the box, even when she was ill. She wanted to make sure everything was in order." She paused at the heavy door. "She spoke about you often, Mr. Reeves. She loved you very much." I could not respond. My throat was too tight. The safe deposit box was smaller than I expected, just a metal rectangle cold to the touch. I inserted the brass key and turned it, hearing the lock click open with a sound that felt almost sacred. Inside, I found 3 items: a thick manila envelope, a handwritten letter folded into thirds, and a smaller sealed envelope marked for after in Nora's careful script. I took everything to a private reading room the manager offered, closed the door behind me, and sat down with trembling hands. The letter came first. I unfolded it slowly, recognizing every curve of Nora's handwriting, the way she crossed her T's with a slight upward slant, the way she dotted her I's with tiny circles when she was being playful. But there was nothing playful about these words. The date at the top was 18 months before she died. "My dearest Walter," she had written, "if you're reading this, what I feared has begun." I had to stop and breathe. The room felt suddenly airless. "I've watched Melissa for years," the letter continued. "I've seen the way she looks at our home, not with love, but with calculation. I've heard the comments she makes when she thinks no one is listening. She doesn't love Jason Walter. She loves what he represents: access to our family, our home, our savings. I hoped I was wrong. I prayed I was wrong. But I prepared for being right." The pages that followed were detailed, methodical, precise. Nora had outlined specific legal steps I should take, financial protections I should put in place, people I should contact. Douglas Wright's name appeared multiple times, along with instructions to trust him completely. She had thought of everything: documents I would need, questions I should ask, traps I should avoid. I opened the manila envelope next. Inside were trust documents, official and notarized, establishing a fund in my name. Nora had used money from her life insurance and personal savings, $87,000, to create something that Jason and Melissa could never touch. The trust was legally ironclad, protected by layers of paperwork that only a woman who had spent months planning could have assembled. There was more. Receipts showing that Nora had prepaid Douglas Wright's retainer for what she called any legal action required to protect Walter's home and dignity. Bank statements, copies of the house deed, everything I would need to prove ownership, to defend myself, to fight back. But it was the final page of her letter that broke me. "She'll start small," Nora had written, "making you feel like a burden, making you doubt yourself. Then she'll isolate you from Jason, turn him against you, make him choose sides. Next will be the house. She'll want to sell it or take control, convince Jason that it's for the best. And finally, if you resist, she'll try to have you declared incompetent. She'll find doctors who will say what she wants them to say. She'll build a case against your mind, Walter, because that's the only way she can win." I read the words 3 times, each time feeling the truth of them settle deeper into my bones. Nora had seen it all. She had watched Melissa for years, had understood her nature when I was still blind to it, and had prepared a defense that I was only now discovering. "Don't let her win," Walter, the letter concluded. "You're smarter than she thinks and braver than you know. I believe in you. I have always believed in you." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. Tears blurred my vision as I read the final line. "When love becomes obligation, walk away. But walk toward freedom, my love, not into their trap. The smaller envelope will tell you when it's time to go." I looked at the envelope marked, "For after," still sealed, still waiting. Nora had planned even this, the moment when I would need to leave, the signal that would tell me the time had come. I pressed her letter to my chest, just as I had pressed her cracked photograph weeks ago. "You knew," I whispered to the empty room. "You knew everything. And you never stopped protecting me." The 2 weeks that followed were the quietest of my life. I returned from the bank that day and said nothing to anyone. I ate dinner at the table as usual. I completed the tasks Melissa assigned me without complaint. I answered Jason's awkward attempts at conversation with polite, empty words. To them, nothing had changed. They had no idea that behind my silence I was preparing for war. Douglas and I spoke every other day, always in whispered phone calls from the bathroom or during walks around the block. He guided me through the legal steps with patience and precision. I photographed every room in the house, every piece of furniture, every crack in the walls I had built. I gathered documents, the deed, the original blueprints, receipts from 40 years of repairs and improvements. I made copies of everything and stored them in a safe deposit box of my own. Carolyn came by twice, always with soup, always with quiet updates. "The paperwork is ready," she told me during her second visit. "Whenever you are." I was ready. I had been ready since I read Nora's letter. But I waited for the right moment. The moment when I could leave without suspicion, without confrontation, without giving Melissa any chance to stop me. That moment came at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday. I woke without an alarm, my body somehow knowing it was time. The house was silent around me, Jason and Melissa asleep in the master bedroom they had claimed as their own, Lily dreaming in the room down the hall. I dressed in the darkness, moving slowly, carefully, making no sound. My suitcase was small. I had packed it days ago, hiding it in the back of my closet behind boxes of old clothes. Inside was only what mattered: Nora's photograph in its cracked frame, her letters tied with ribbon, the wooden box with its memories and its brass key, a few changes of clothes. 40 years of possessions surrounded me: furniture we had chosen together, books we had read aloud to each other, kitchen tools that still held the memory of her hands, but I left them all behind. They were just things. Nora had taught me that. Things can be replaced. Dignity cannot. Before I left, I walked through the house one final time. I started in the kitchen, running my palm across the yellow walls she had painted so many years ago. The color had faded to something softer now, more cream than sunshine, but I could still see her standing on a stepladder with a brush in her hand, laughing at a joke I had made, a streak of paint across her cheek. I touched the spot where she used to stand while making coffee, the counter worn smooth by decades of morning routines. I moved to the living room where the banister I had carved by hand curved up toward the second floor. I had spent 3 weekends on that banister, sanding it until it was smooth as glass, staining it a deep mahogany that Nora said reminded her of her grandmother's house. I gripped it now and felt the solidity of my own work, the permanence of something built with love and skill. Finally, I stood in the doorway of Jason's childhood bedroom. The baseball posters were still on the walls, faded now, their edges curling. His Little League trophies gathered dust on the shelf. I remembered teaching him to throw a curveball in the backyard, remembered cheering from the stands when he hit his first home run, remembered the pride in his eyes when he told me he wanted to be just like me when he grew up. Tears fell, but my step did not falter. This was not defeat. This was strategic retreat, leaving a position that could no longer be defended, falling back to ground where I could stand and fight. On the kitchen table, I left a single sheet of paper. The note was brief. I'm going somewhere safe. Don't try to find me. The house will be handled legally. Dad. I did not explain more. I did not owe them more. She was waiting on her porch despite the hour, a cup of coffee already in her hands, the lights of her living room glowing warm against the darkness. "It's done?" she asked as I climbed the steps. "It's done." She led me inside to a guest room. She had prepared fresh sheets, a reading lamp, a small vase of flowers on the nightstand. It smelled like lavender, like safety, like the beginning of something new. I handed her a folder thick with documents. "The next phase is yours," I said. "Douglas will handle the paperwork. But you'll need to make a decision." Carolyn took the folder and held it against her chest. Her eyes were bright with something I recognized, the same quiet determination I had seen in Nora's face 1,000 times. "I made my decision 2 years ago," she said. "When Nora asked me to watch over you." Through the window, I could see the first pale light of dawn beginning to break over the rooftops. Somewhere across town, the house I had built with my own hands was waking up without me. Soon Melissa would find my note. Soon the shouting would begin, but I would not be there to hear it. As the light grew stronger, I turned away from the window. Nora had told me when to walk. Now she was showing me where to walk toward. I spent 2 days at Carolyn's house waiting. I did not call Jason. I did not answer the 14 messages Melissa left on my phone, each one more furious than the last. I simply waited, drinking coffee in Carolyn's sunny kitchen, reading books from her shelf, letting the silence heal something inside me that had been wounded for too long. On the morning of the 3rd day, Carolyn put on her best dress, a navy blue outfit I remembered from Nora's funeral, and picked up a keyring from the counter. "It's time," she said. I wanted to go with her. I wanted to see Melissa's face when she learned the truth. But Douglas had advised against it. "Let the professionals handle the delivery," he had said. "You stay out of sight. There will be time for confrontation later if you want it." So I stayed behind and waited some more. Carolyn returned 2 hours later, and the expression on her face told me everything I needed to know before she said a single word. She was trying not to smile, but her eyes were bright with something that looked very much like satisfaction. "Tell me," I said. She sat down across from me and poured herself a cup of coffee, taking her time, savoring the moment. "A representative from Douglas's office arrived first," she began. "A woman named Patricia, very professional, very calm. She pulled into the driveway in a black SUV, briefcase in hand. Melissa must have thought she was a realtor or a social worker come to help find you. She actually smiled when she opened the door. I could picture it perfectly, Melissa's practiced charm, her assumption that any visitor could be manipulated. Patricia introduced herself and explained that she was there to conduct a final inspection. "The new owner takes possession on Friday," she said. Just like that, calm as anything. And Melissa Carolyn's smile finally broke through. Her face went white, absolutely white. She said, "What new owner?" And Patricia explained that the house had been legally sold. The transaction closed yesterday. You, as sole owner, had every right to sell. All proper notices were filed. 30 days to vacate. I closed my eyes, feeling something release in my chest. It was done. The house I had built was safe from Melissa's grasping hands forever. She started screaming, of course, Carolyn continued, threatening lawsuits, demanding to speak to a manager. She called Patricia a fraud, called you senile, said no court in the country would uphold the sale. Carolyn paused, her eyes sparkling. That's when I walked in. You were there. I'd been waiting in Patricia's car. We timed it perfectly. She took a long sip of coffee. I walked through the front door with my new keys in my hand. Melissa just stared at me. I don't think she understood at first. I said, "Hello, dear. I'm the new owner." The image was almost too perfect to believe. Carolyn Blake, the quiet neighbor the woman Melissa had dismissed as nosy and irrelevant, walking into that house as its rightful owner. Her face, Carolyn said softly. Walter, I wish you could have seen her face. It was like watching someone realize they've been standing on a trapdoor the whole time. What did she say? She couldn't speak at first, just opened and closed her mouth like a fish. Then she started screaming again how this was illegal, how she would fight it, how I had no right. Carolyn set down her cup. I told her the truth. I said, Nora asked me to watch over this house. I've been saving for years, waiting for the right moment. I'd say the moment has arrived. I thought of Nora, of her careful planning, of the trust fund she had established, the lawyer she had retained, the friend she had enlisted. Even from beyond the grave, she was protecting what we had built together. Melissa threatened me, of course, Carolyn continued. Said she knew people. Said I would regret this. I just smiled and told her she had 30 days to vacate and that moving assistance had been arranged if she needed it. She laughed quietly. I think that was the part that really broke her, the politeness. She didn't know what to do with someone who wouldn't scream back. My phone buzzed on the table. I looked down and saw Jason's name on the screen. The first time he had called me directly since I left. She's already gotten to him, I said. Carolyn nodded. She grabbed her phone before I even finished speaking. Started shrieking at him to fix this, to call you, to do something. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Are you ready to talk to him? I looked at the phone, still buzzing, Jason's name flashing with each ring. For a moment I considered answering, but then I remembered all the times he had failed to answer me, all the excuses, all the avoidance, all the silence when I needed him most. I let it go to voicemail. Not yet, I said. Let them sit with it for a while. Let them understand what they've lost. Carolyn squeezed my hand. Nora would be proud of you. I picked up my coffee and looked out the window at the quiet street, at the ordinary morning unfolding outside. Somewhere across town, Melissa was screaming into her phone, demanding that Jason fix the unfixable. Somewhere, my son was learning that his father was not the weak old man he had assumed. And here in this small kitchen, I was finally free. Douglas found me a cabin by the lake, a small place with weathered shingles and a porch that faced the water. It belonged to a client of his who spent winters in Florida and was happy to rent it month to month. The price was reasonable, the location was quiet, and most importantly, no one knew I was there. I arrived on a Thursday evening with my single suitcase and a bag of groceries Carolyn had packed for me. The cabin smelled of pine and old books, and when I opened the windows, the breeze carried the scent of the lake across the worn floorboards. I stood on the porch and watched the sun set over the water, painting everything in shades of gold and rose, and I felt something I had not felt in years. Peace. My phone sat on the kitchen table, buzzing every few hours with calls I did not answer. By the end of the first day, there were 12 missed calls. By the second day, 29. By the third morning, the number had climbed to 47, 34 from Melissa, 13 from Jason. I watched the count rise with a detachment that surprised me. For 3 years, I had jumped at every demand, flinched at every criticism, rushed to answer every summons. Now, sitting in this quiet cabin with the lake stretching out before me, I discovered that silence could feel like power instead of submission. I listened to the voicemails eventually, not to respond, but to understand. Melissa's messages told a story of disintegration. The first ones were furious, her voice sharp with outrage. You can't do this. This is fraud. I'm calling a lawyer and we're going to sue you for everything you have. The second wave turned threatening. I know people, Walter. Important people. This isn't over. You're going to regret this for the rest of your miserable life. But by the third day, something had cracked. Her voice grew desperate, pleading. Please, Walter, be reasonable. We can work this out. Just call me back. The final message came at 2 in the morning, and she was sobbing. We're going to lose everything. The cars. The credit cards. Everything. How could you do this to your own family? How could you just abandon us? I listened to each one, feeling nothing but a distant pity. Then I deleted them all. Jason's messages were different, quieter, more broken. Dad, I don't understand. His voice in the first one sounded hollow, confused. Why didn't you tell me? Why wouldn't you talk to me first? I could have helped. I could have done something. The second message came hours later, and I could tell he had been crying. I know I failed you. I know. I should have stood up to her. I should have protected you. But please, Dad, we have nowhere else to go. Lily keeps asking where you are. She misses you. The third message was just breathing long and uneven before the line went dead. I saved those. I was not sure why. Between the calls I lived. It sounds simple, but after 3 years of existing in survival mode, living felt revolutionary. I fished in the lake each morning, casting my line into the still water and waiting with a patience I had forgotten I possessed. I caught a bass on the second day and cooked it for dinner, seasoning it with lemon and herbs the way Nora used to. I read her letters in the evenings, spreading them across the kitchen table and letting her words wash over me like a balm. One night I cooked spaghetti and ate it on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one over the water. The sauce was too salty, and the noodles were slightly overcooked, but it was the best meal I had eaten in years because I had made it for myself in my own time, without anyone sighing at how long it took or complaining about the mess. I realized, sitting there with the empty plate on my lap and the lake shimmering in the moonlight, that this was the first time in 3 years I had felt like myself. Not a burden to be managed, not an obstacle to be removed, not dead weight to be complained about and planned around. Just Walter Reeves, the man who builds things, who loves deeply, who deserved better than what his family had given him. The text arrived at midnight on the 4th day. I had already turned off the lights and was lying in bed listening to the gentle lap of water against the dock when my phone glowed on the nightstand. I almost ignored it, but something made me reach over and look at the screen. It was from Jason. Dad, please. I need to see you. There's something I have to tell you, something I should have told you months ago. Please. I read the message 3 times, searching for the manipulation, the angle, the hidden agenda, but there was nothing clever in those words. No demands, no threats, no excuses. For the first time since this began, my son sounded like he was telling the truth. I set the phone down and stared at the ceiling, listening to my own heartbeat in the silence. Tomorrow I would decide whether to answer. I waited 2 more days before I responded to Jason's message. Part of me wanted to make him suffer the way I had suffered, ignored, dismissed, left waiting for a response that might never come. But a larger part of me understood that revenge and healing were not the same thing, and I was tired of carrying anger like a stone in my chest. I sent him a single text, the cabin's address, and a time. 2 o'clock Saturday afternoon. No explanation, no promises. He arrived 10 minutes early. I watched from the window as his car pulled into the gravel drive. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment before getting out, and when he finally emerged, I barely recognized him. My son looked like he had aged 10 years in 2 weeks. His clothes were wrinkled, his face unshaven, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He moved toward the cabin with the shuffling gait of a man who had forgotten how to stand up straight. I opened the door before he could knock. Dad. His voice cracked on the single syllable. I need to tell you the truth, all of it. I stepped aside and let him in. He didn't sit down. He stood in the middle of the small living room, his hands hanging at his sides, his whole body trembling like a building about to collapse. I waited. I had learned the power of silence, and I used it now. I knew, he finally said. The words came out broken, jagged, torn from somewhere deep. Dad, I knew what Melissa was planning. I felt something cold move through my chest, but I kept my face still. Tell me. She showed me the nursing home brochures at Christmas. He was crying now, tears streaming down his face unchecked. Sunrise Gardens. She said it was just research, just in case you got worse. She talked about managing your care, finding professionals who could handle you better than we could. His voice rose. I told myself it was nothing, just options, just planning ahead. He fell to his knees on the cabin floor, his sobs echoing off the wooden walls. But I knew he gasped. I knew what she really wanted. She toured the facility in February. She talked to doctors about how to document cognitive decline. She was building a case, Dad, collecting evidence, finding witnesses, preparing to have you declared incompetent. He looked up at me with devastation written across every feature. The birthday party, the way she talked about you in front of the guests, it was all part of it. She was testing the waters, seeing who would back her up. I thought of the party, of sitting alone on the porch, of the crushed cake and the overheard conversation about elderly parents being burdens. Every moment had been calculated. Every humiliation had been deliberate. Why didn't you stop her? My voice was quiet, but it cut through his sobs like a blade. I was scared. The admission seemed to drain whatever strength he had left. Scared of losing her, scared of confrontation, scared of everything. He pressed his forehead to the floor. I chose her over you, Dad. I chose my own cowardice over my father. I'll never forgive myself. Never. I stood there looking down at my son, this man I had raised, this child I had loved with everything I had. He was broken now, shattered by his own choices, and part of me wanted to reach down and pull him up, to tell him it would be all right. But another part, the part that had been shoved and mocked and exiled to the porch, while my wife's memory was trampled, that part stayed still. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a message from an unknown number. But I recognized it, the same number that had texted me weeks ago with a promise to save everything. Lily. Her message was brief. I saved it all, Grandpa. Mom can't lie anymore. I love you. Below the text was a video file. I pressed play. The screen filled with images I recognized, moments captured from angles I hadn't noticed, recorded by a child who had watched everything with serious eyes and steady hands. Melissa's face twisted with contempt as she called me useless dead weight. The shove that sent me crashing into Nora's photograph. The crushed cake handed through the door. The threats hissed in the kitchen. Dozens of clips stitched together into an undeniable record of cruelty. My granddaughter had been building evidence for months. She had documented her mother's abuse while pretending to play games on her iPad, had saved every moment of ugliness, had waited until the time was right to send it all to me. 11 years old and braver than her father had ever been. Jason looked up from the floor, his face wet with tears. Dad, what is it? I turned the phone screen toward him and let him watch. His expression shifted from confusion to horror to something that looked like the final collapse of everything he had tried to believe about his wife. When the video ended, silence filled the cabin. I looked at my son, broken, ashamed, finally honest, and at the phone showing my granddaughter's quiet courage. I thought of Nora, of her letters, of her faith, that I would find my way through this. The question isn't whether I can forgive you, I said quietly. The question is whether you can become someone worth forgiving. Jason left the cabin that afternoon with nothing resolved between us. I did not embrace him. I did not tell him everything would be all right. I simply watched him drive away down the gravel road, his shoulders hunched over the steering wheel, and I let him carry the weight of his confession alone. It was not cruelty. It was truth. Some burdens cannot be shared until the person carrying them learns how heavy they really are. A week passed. I spent it in the quiet rhythms I had discovered, fishing at dawn, reading in the afternoons, cooking simple dinners that tasted like freedom. I thought about Jason constantly, about Lily's videos, about the woman my son had married and the man he had become under her influence. But I made no decisions. I let the silence do its work. On the 7th day, Carolyn's car appeared in the driveway. She emerged carrying a pie dish covered in foil and a canvas bag over her shoulder. Her smile was warm but careful, the expression of someone who understood that healing takes its own time. Apple crumble, she said, holding up the dish. Nora's recipe. I thought you might be ready for some company. I was. I hadn't realized how much until I saw her standing there, this woman who had been Nora's closest friend for 4 decades, who had watched over me when I couldn't watch over myself. We sat on the porch with slices of pie and cups of coffee, looking out at the lake. The afternoon light was soft, filtering through the trees in golden shafts that reminded me of the way sunlight used to fall through our kitchen windows, the yellow kitchen Nora had painted so many years ago. Tell me about her, I said. The things I don't know. Carolyn smiled, her eyes distant with memory. She was fiercer than you realized. You saw the gentle parts, the nurse who held patients' hands, the wife who made everything beautiful. But underneath that, Walter, she was a warrior. She told me stories I had never heard. About the time Nora confronted a doctor who was mistreating elderly patients standing in his office until he agreed to change his ways. About the letters she wrote to politicians about healthcare reform, letters that actually got responses. About the quiet way she had organized the neighborhood women to support a young mother whose husband had left her, making sure she never felt alone. She used to talk about you constantly, Carolyn said. She'd say, Walter doesn't know how strong he is. He thinks kindness means enduring, but real kindness has teeth. Real kindness knows when to bite. I looked down at my coffee, feeling those words settle into my bones. She left something else, Carolyn said softly. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out an envelope, the smaller one from the safe deposit box, the one marked "For After" in Nora's handwriting. Douglas asked me to bring it when I thought you were ready. I took it with trembling hands. The paper was soft with age, the edges slightly worn. I turned it over and slid my finger under the flap, breaking the seal that Nora had pressed closed years ago. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in handwriting that I recognized, but barely weaker than her usual script. The letters wavering slightly, written by a hand that was losing its strength. This letter had come from her final days, from the time when we both knew she was leaving, and neither of us could say it out loud. My dearest Walter, she had written. If you're reading this, you did it. You walked away. You chose yourself, maybe for the first time in your life. I'm so proud of you, my love. Prouder than words can hold. I had to stop and breathe. The lake blurred before me. Now here's your final instruction, the letter continued. Don't let this end with revenge. Revenge is a house with no windows. It keeps you trapped inside your own anger. Let it end with freedom instead. Let it end with you walking out into the sunlight and never looking back. I turned the page. Your kindness was never your weakness, Walter. It was your gift. The world needs people who build things instead of tearing them down, who see the good in others, even when the good is hard to find. But kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. You learned that the hard way. I wish I could have protected you from that lesson, but some things we have to learn for ourselves. Carolyn's hand found mine and held it gently. The next lesson is harder, Nora had written. Forgiveness. Not for them, for you. Forgiveness isn't saying what they did was acceptable. It isn't pretending the wounds don't exist. It's putting down the weight so you can walk forward without carrying their sins on your back. They'll carry their own sins soon enough. That's not your burden anymore. I was weeping now. Not the quiet tears that had come before, not the controlled grief of a man trying to hold himself together. These were sobs that shook my whole body, tears that had been waiting years to fall. I wept for Nora, for the life we had built, for the man I had become under Melissa's cruelty, and the man I was trying to become now. I wept because my wife had known me, truly known me in ways I was only beginning to understand. Carolyn said nothing. She simply held my hand and let me cry, her presence steady and warm beside me. Some moments don't need words, they just need witness. When the tears finally slowed, I turned to the last lines of Nora's letter. Build something new, Walter, she had written. You're too good at building to stop now. And this time, build it just for you. I kept Nora's letter folded in my shirt pocket for 3 days, close to my heart. I read it each morning and each night, letting her words become part of me. Build something new. The instruction was clear, but I understood that before I could build, I had to finish tearing down. There was one more wall that needed to come down, one final confrontation that had to happen before I could truly walk forward. I called Carolyn on a Tuesday morning. I need to go back to the house, I said. One last time. She didn't ask why. She simply said, I'll drive. We arrived at noon. The house looked different in the harsh daylight, smaller, somehow diminished, as if it knew it was no longer mine. A moving truck sat in the driveway, its back doors hanging open. Boxes were stacked on the porch I had built, filled with possessions that had never belonged there in the first place. Carolyn squeezed my arm. Are you ready? No, I admitted. But I'm going anyway. We walked up the path together, past the flower beds Nora had planted, past the mailbox I had installed our first summer here. The front door stood open, and through it I could see the empty living room, the bare walls, the spaces where 40 years of memories had once lived. Melissa was inside, taping a box shut with sharp, angry movements. She looked up when she heard our footsteps, and I watched her face cycle through emotions like a slot machine searching for the winning combination. First came anger, a flash of rage that tightened her jaw and narrowed her eyes. Then calculation, her mind clearly working through possibilities, strategies, angles of attack. And finally, when she realized that neither anger nor scheming would serve her here, she settled on sweetness. Her expression softened, her shoulders relaxed. She even managed something that almost resembled a smile. "Walter." She set down the tape and walked toward me, her hands extended as if greeting an old friend. "I'm so glad you came. I've been hoping we could talk." I said nothing. I simply watched her perform. "I know things got difficult," she continued, her voice dripping with manufactured warmth. "I made mistakes. We all did. But we're family, Walter. Families work through their problems." She reached for my arm. "Let's sit down and talk about this. I'm sure we can figure something out." I stepped back and her hand closed on empty air. "We're not family, Melissa." The words came out calm and clear, without anger, without bitterness. I had practiced them in my mind for days, but now that the moment had arrived, I didn't need practice. The truth spoke itself. Family doesn't look at an old man and see a problem to be solved. Family doesn't plan to lock someone away in a nursing home because they're inconvenient. Family doesn't stand by while their spouse shoves a 68-year-old man to the ground and then blame him for being in the way. Her mask flickered. I saw the sweetness struggling to hold cracks forming at the edges. "I'm not here to punish you," I continued. "I'm not here to gloat or to watch you suffer. I'm here to tell you one thing, and then I'm leaving." I held her gaze, and for the first time in 3 years I did not look away first. "You have no power over me anymore. Whatever happens next in your life, the consequences, the struggles, the choices you make, none of it will include me. I'm done." The mask shattered. Melissa's face twisted into something ugly, something true. The sweetness vanished like smoke, replaced by the contempt I had seen so many times before, but that she had always tried to hide behind closed doors. "You think you've won," she hissed. "You think selling the house and running away to some pathetic cabin makes you strong." She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You're a foolish old man who just destroyed his own family. Jason will never forgive you for this. Your granddaughter will grow up knowing her grandfather abandoned her. And you," she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper, "you're going to die alone in that cabin and no one will even notice. No one will care. You'll rot there for weeks before anyone thinks to check." I smiled. Genuinely smiled. It was not the reaction she expected. I saw confusion flash across her face, then fury at being denied the wound she had tried to inflict. "Maybe," I said, "maybe I will die alone. Maybe no one will notice for a while." I shrugged, feeling lighter than I had in years. "But I'll die free, Melissa. I'll die knowing that my last years were spent in peace, surrounded by people who actually love me, doing things that actually matter. Can you say the same?" She had no answer. For the first time since I had known her, Melissa was speechless. I turned and walked toward the door. Carolyn fell into step beside me, her presence steady and reassuring. Behind us, I heard Melissa's breathing grow ragged, heard the rustle of her moving, heard the buildup of something that had been pressurized too long. "I hate you." The scream echoed through the empty house, bouncing off the bare walls, filling the space where so many quieter cruelties had been whispered. I paused on the threshold I had built with my own hands, the doorframe I had measured and cut and sanded smooth. I did not turn around. I did not raise my voice. "I know," I said softly. "That's your burden to carry now, not mine." Then I stepped outside and Carolyn closed the door behind us. The sunlight was warm on my face. The birds were singing in the trees I had planted decades ago. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed its summer song. I walked down the path past the flower beds, past the mailbox, and I did not look back. Not once. The house grew smaller behind me with every step, and with it the weight I had carried for 3 long years. Nora had told me to build something new. But first, I had needed to say goodbye to the old, and now finally I had. The weeks that followed were the quietest of my life, and I mean that as the highest compliment. Quiet had once felt like emptiness, like absence, like being forgotten. Now it felt like breathing room, like space to grow. I made the cabin my own, piece by piece, day by day. The porch had a creak in the third board from the left. I fixed it on a Tuesday morning, kneeling in the sunshine with my tools spread around me, feeling the satisfaction of making something right. The window in the bedroom stuck when the humidity rose. I sanded the frame until it slid smooth and easy. Small repairs, small victories, each one a reminder that my hands still knew how to build. In the patch of earth beside the front steps, I planted a garden. Yellow flowers, the same shade Nora had chosen for our kitchen all those years ago, marigolds and black-eyed Susans and bright golden zinnias that caught the morning light like captured sunshine. I knelt in the dirt and thought of her belief that certain colors could make a space feel warm even on the darkest days. She was right. She was always right. I built a birdhouse too, a simple one-cedar wood with a sloped roof mounted on a post near the dock, where I could watch the sparrows come and go while I drank my morning coffee. It was the kind of project I had never had time for before. There was always something more urgent, always someone else's needs to attend to, always another task on Melissa's endless list. But now my time was my own, and I spent it building things that served no purpose except to bring me joy. Lily came every other weekend. Carolyn arranged it with Jason, who had moved out of the house and was staying with a friend across town. I didn't ask for details. I simply welcomed my granddaughter when she arrived and watched her blossom in the absence of tension. She laughed more now. She talked more too, chattering about school, about her friends, about the books she was reading, and the videos she was making. She showed me her drawings, elaborate fantasy worlds, filled with castles and dragons and brave princesses who rescued themselves. She never mentioned her mother, and I never asked. Some wounds heal better in silence. Some conversations can wait until the people having them are ready. One afternoon, as I was sanding the edges of a new shelf I was building for the kitchen, Lily appeared at my elbow with curious eyes. "Grandpa," she said, "I want to learn to build things too." I smiled a real smile, the kind that starts deep in the chest and works its way up, and handed her a hammer. "Then let's start with the basics." We spent the rest of the afternoon together, measuring and marking and driving nails into scrap wood. Her first attempts were crooked, her hammer swings uncertain, but she didn't give up. She had her grandmother's stubbornness, I realized. She had Nora's determination to get things right. Jason's letter arrived on a Thursday, tucked between a utility bill and a catalog I hadn't ordered. There was no return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately, the same careful script I had taught him decades ago when he was just learning to form his letters. I took the envelope to the dock and opened it there, with the lake stretching out before me and the afternoon sun warm on my shoulders. "Dad," he had written, "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and I won't pretend I do. I'm writing to tell you that I've left Melissa. I finally saw what she is. I finally saw what I became with her, someone weak, someone cruel, someone who let his own father be treated like garbage because he was too afraid to speak up. I kept reading my chest tight. I'm staying with a friend. I'm going to therapy, trying to understand how I let it get so bad. I'm not the son you deserve, Dad, I know that. But I want to become someone you could respect again, even if it takes years, even if it takes the rest of my life." The letter ended without asking for anything. No pleas for reconciliation, no requests for money or help. Just a confession and a promise to do better. I sat with it for a long time, watching the sun sink toward the water. I thought about Nora's words, "Forgiveness isn't for them, it's for you." I wasn't ready to forgive fully. The wounds were still too fresh, the memories too sharp. But I wasn't ready to close the door completely either. I folded the letter carefully and carried it inside. I placed it in Nora's wooden box alongside her letters, her photographs, and the brass key that had started everything. It belonged there, I decided. Among the things that mattered, among the things worth keeping. A week later, I picked up a pen and a piece of paper. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, thinking about what to say, how to say it, whether to say anything at all. In the end, I wrote 3 words: "I'm still here." Then I added Carolyn's address at the bottom, folded the paper into an envelope, and walked it out to the mailbox. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a door left open, just a crack. 6 months passed like water flowing over smooth stones, steady, gentle, transforming everything it touched without force or violence. The cabin by the lake had become something more than shelter now. It had become home. I had aged in those months, but not the way I aged under Melissa's roof. That was a shrinking kind of aging, a diminishing, a becoming less with every passing day. Now I was aging like oak, weathered but solid, marked by time but strengthened by it. My joints still ached in the morning. My hair had gone fully silver, but I stood straighter than I had in years, and when I looked in the mirror, I recognized the man looking back. Carolyn visited every week, sometimes more. We had become dear friends in the truest sense, 2 people united by our love for a woman who was gone but somehow still present in everything we did. We drank coffee on the porch and talked about Nora, about the old days, about nothing at all. Sometimes we just sat in comfortable silence, watching the birds visit the feeder I had built, listening to the lake lap against the shore. Lily came every other weekend without fail. She had grown taller in these months, her face losing the last soft curves of childhood, but her eyes still held that serious, knowing quality I had come to treasure. She had learned to build a proper birdhouse, now measured correctly, nailed straight, painted in colors she chose herself. We had made 3 of them together, mounted on posts around the property, each one a small monument to the hours we spent side by side. News of Melissa reached me occasionally, carried on the wind of small-town gossip that Carolyn couldn't help but overhear. The picture it painted was not surprising, but there was no satisfaction in it either, only a distant kind of recognition, like watching weather happen to someone else's house. She had burned through 2 relationships already, each one shorter than the last. Her own parents had finally cut ties after she demanded they mortgage their home to help her get back on her feet. She had lost her job, something about complaints from coworkers, about a pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored. Without victims to exploit, without a foundation of manipulation to stand on, her life had simply collapsed. Her character had always been a house built on sand. I had not needed to tear it down. I had only needed to step out of the way and let gravity do its work. That was the quiet revenge, I realized. Not destruction, not confrontation, just becoming unnecessary to watch your antagonist self-destruct. Jason came to see me for the first time in early autumn, 3 months after I sent my short letter. He arrived nervous and uncertain, standing at the edge of the property like he wasn't sure he had the right to step closer. I waved him in. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. We just started working, raking leaves, stacking firewood, doing the quiet labor that men sometimes use to say things words cannot express. He came back the next month, and the month after that. The visits were careful, tentative. He never stayed long. He never asked for much. He helped with whatever needed doing, asked about my day, and left before wearing out his welcome. It wasn't the relationship we once had. It might never be again. But it was honest, and honesty was something we had not had between us in years. During one visit, as we sat on the porch watching the sun sink toward the trees, Jason spoke the words I could tell he had been carrying for months. "I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to protect you, Dad." I looked at my son, this man I had raised, this child I had loved through every stage of his life, this person who had failed me in ways that still ached when I thought about them too long, and I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but something close to it, something that made room for what came next. "I'm sorry too," I said. "I'm sorry I didn't teach you that strength isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about knowing which battles matter." He nodded slowly, his eyes wet. We didn't say anything else. We didn't need to. On a warm evening in late summer, I sat on the dock with Nora's photograph beside me, watching the sun paint the water in shades of gold and rose. Behind me, Lily ran through the meadow, chasing fireflies, her laughter echoing across the lake like music I had forgotten how to hear. I had built something new, not a house this time, but a life. A quiet life. A free life. A life where I wasn't in anyone's way because I had finally stepped onto my own path. Nora smiled at me from behind the cracked glass of her frame. I smiled back. For years, they told me to go away. They treated me like furniture, to be moved like a problem, to be solved like a burden too heavy to carry. So I walked away. Not in defeat and decision. Turns out walking away was never about giving up. It was about choosing myself for the first time in years. I built that house with these 2 hands and 40 years of love. But the best thing I ever built was the life I'm living now, small, quiet, and entirely my own. Nora always said I was too good at building to stop. She was right. I just needed to learn that sometimes the strongest thing you can build is a boundary, and the second strongest thing, the courage to walk through the door it creates. Walter Reeves spent 68 years believing that kindness meant endurance, that love meant sacrifice, that family meant accepting whatever treatment came his way. It took being shoved to the ground in his own home, watching his wife's photograph shatter beneath him, to finally understand what Nora had been trying to tell him all along. Some doors are meant to be closed. Some battles are worth fighting. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply walk away. This story reminds us that age does not diminish our worth. That the houses we build with our hands and hearts belong to us no matter who tries to claim them. That quiet strength is still strength, and that revenge served cold, served through dignity and legal precision rather than anger, is often the most satisfying kind of all. Walter found his freedom not by destroying his enemies, but by removing himself from their reach. He found his peace not by winning arguments, but by refusing to have them. And in the end, he discovered that the life waiting on the other side of that closed door was better than anything he had left behind. If this story touched your heart, if you saw yourself or someone you love in Walter's journey, I hope you will share it with others who need to hear it. There are too many people out there living under roofs that have become prisons, too many voices being silenced by those who should protect them. Stories like this remind us that it is never too late to choose ourselves. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your time and your attention mean more than you know. Now, I would love to hear from you. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who didn't value you? Have you ever found freedom on the other side of a door you were afraid to open? Share your story in the comments below. You never know who might need to read your words today. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. We have many more journeys to take together, and I cannot wait to share them with you. Until next time, remember, you are not a burden. You are not dead weight. You are someone worth fighting for, even if the person who needs to fight for you is yourself.